For 26 years that I've been doing this, we've been saying the big issue is that unfortunate single word, and the single word is depression. And it has certain meanings. Now, depress technically means to push down. You depress a gas pedal. It just means you push it down. So, for example, if someone calls me and their husband or wife has just died or their child has died, and they say they're depressed, which is a self-diagnosis or a self-statement at best, and they say they're depressed, I do not take that as a literal depression. The classic issue is that the symptoms of depression, being depressed by an event, are one, numbness, which companies almost all agree with the being, and then followed by an inability to concentrate or focus, which can last an indeterminate amount of time. Two is major issues with either eating patterns or sleeping patterns, and those can range from not being able to eat to eating everything on the planet and go back and forth in the same day. Same with sleep. Okay. And then a roller coaster of emotions. Those are very common, normal, and natural reactions to the death of someone meaningful to you. Of themselves, they are not clinical depressions. They are not MDEs, major depressive episodes. They do not indicate bipolar. They just indicate that someone has been zapped, whether it has been a long-term illness that they were then expecting the death or a sudden death. The zap, the reality of the death, does something to the human condition. It evokes what I tend to call emotional novocaine, which explains the numbness that most grievers report early on. The problem is almost all of those four symptoms that I mentioned also happen to be typical, to the best of my knowledge, again, not as a clinician, to those who have a real mental condition called depression or bipolar or any of those combinations of words. And the unfortunate tragedy that the drug companies have played on is that word is a parallel word used for different meanings. If I say, how are you doing today? I'm a little depressed, whatever. That doesn't mean you're clinically depressed. It just means right now today you don't have a lot of energy. Something is pushed down. And the drug companies have manipulated that idea to the idea that if you feel down, you are depressed. So if a widow comes in 2 weeks later and says, after her husband dies, and says, I'm depressed, he goes, oh, depressed, and gives her Prozac or whatever SSRI fits the bill. My wife and I have been struggling. This is the intent, because they're afraid that the GP will miss a diagnosis and the woman will commit suicide. Well, there's a whole lot of other issues there. If the doctor is talking to a person on an emotionally based issue like grief and doesn't know already whether or not she's ever been diagnosed as MDE or major depressive episode, and if he doesn't know that grief doesn't cause depression, grief doesn't cause depression. Now, if you already have depression, it might trigger something, but even those people, the scientists guys who are even psychiatrists will tell you, I happen to have, a mental, whatever you call it, depression, but I can distinguish it from grief. Now, the big distinction is that there is suicidal ideation in depressives and some other things, meaninglessness of life and all kinds of things. Those are not typical for grieving people. And the biggest issue is that the APA doesn't want to trust the doctors to make a mistake. The big issue is, why are you letting doctors prescribe those drugs anyway? What I can tell you is, over the years, I'll get a call, and it's a year after a widow calls me, and her husband died a year ago. And by the time, and she was given Valium and then other stronger drugs or different drugs over the year. And who calls me is a zombie. You almost can't understand her, and it takes a while to ferret out what's going on in the conversation. And when you finally do, you discover they've been covering up her feelings for a year or two, based on her going to a GP 2 weeks, a month after her husband. I said, I'm not feeling so, doc, I'm a little depressed. And he gives her the meds because he didn't know what else to do. Now, the vast majority of people who called me on the Grief Recovery Helpline that we maintained for many years, and called as a result of a death, not so much for divorce, although I handle a lot of that too. The vast majority of those people called me a year or two after the death. Imagine what it takes to call a stranger on an 800 number because your heart is hurting so badly. And a certain amount of them were on meds, but the meds weren't helping them. In fact, it was making it worse. A huge percentage of them, even those who called much earlier, 2, 3, 4 months, even weeks after death, if you listen, a therapist or psychiatrist could make a huge mistake and hear someone ideating suicide when they weren't. What they were ideating was pain, sadness, frustration. So if someone says, God, I just can't take it anymore, and so I might say, oh, you're just overwhelmed with your grief. And I'll say, yeah, that's it. And mainly what it is, it's no one's ever heard. When I would talk to these people and they would use language that others would call ideating suicide, I'm just talking, no, they're just grieving. And what I realized over the years is they just needed someone to hear them. How meaningful it was. They use that language to try to get attention. But then people say, oh, don't feel that way. And I say, of course you feel that way. Your whole universe is upside down. And then the conversation shifts. From that point forward, all of a sudden their voices would get some energy back because for the first time in a year or two or however many months, someone heard them. Heard what they were saying, heard what they were trying to communicate and have heard. They weren't talking about suicide. If they were, they weren't going to call me on the grief recovery helpline. Why would they be calling that number if they want to go out? So if they're calling me, there's a part of them that still wants to have life make sense, no matter what their language is. The vast, vast, vast majority on planet Earth who are depressed already are before a grief event happens. And I mean vast. They've already been identified or have identified themselves. If they're going outwards at all to any professional help, therapist, psychiatrist, even an MD, and for other things, they will have identified themselves as struggling with something, even if they can't identify it. Their alerts have already happened. They don't suddenly happen when a grief event happens. That's the flaw that I think many of the people who have written the DSM-5 are coming from. They're coming from the flaw that someone is a hidden depressive or are suddenly depressed. I don't agree on the sudden depression. Grief is the normal and natural reaction to loss. Of itself, grief is neither a pathological condition nor a personality disorder. Therefore, the biggest issue when grief happens isn't pathology. The biggest issue is the misinformation we all have about dealing with grief. Because from the earliest age that you and I were, we were taught don't feel bad when feeling bad was normal, which is why when I help grievers, they like me because they go, oh gosh, how devastating for you, rather than, oh, you shouldn't be thinking that way. The issue that's at hand here is the normalcy of grief has been subjugated to abnormalcy because from the early stage we're told that you shouldn't feel bad even when you do. And the bottom line you can take away from me, I do not believe that grief, even the most diabolical loss, no matter what it is, creates depression, in part because everybody's individual. Now, if you're inclined to be depressive, then you're going to react depressively to anything that comes your way. But if you're not, you don't. You don't all of a sudden become depressed. Because here's the other thing you have to understand. The current grief that affects you, whatever has just happened in your life, whoever's life it is not the first loss in their life. They've had scores of losses of various dimension and various degrees, whether it's deaths or divorces and career and health issues, all kinds of things have happened. So the latest one is not a depression creator any more than the first one was. The real issue is, what do I do about it? In a crisis, we go back to our old beliefs and old behaviors. So when a grief happens, our brain automatically goes to our longest held stored information. So if as a little boy you were taught don't feel bad and time heals, you got to be strong and all this other insanity instead of being truthful about your loss, then you will immediately go back. Most people are on automatic pilot with incorrect information.